becomes more right-wing politically, which I think is pretty undeniable to note, as Israel becomes more orthodox religiously, which also demographically seems quite likely, does it run the risk of alienating that liberal North American base that has been heretofore such a significant part of the diaspora and support for the state?
Well, sure, it runs that risk, but not only because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is all we've been talking about tonight. There's another huge problem which has to do with religion, that the state of Israel privileges orthodoxy over Reform and conservative Judaism, which the overwhelming majority of North American Jews subscribe to. And on issues like marriage, conversion, personal status, there's an extremely rigid Orthodox stranglehold, really, over these issues in Israel. That has caused debates, controversies, dissents between American Jewry and Israel as great as the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's point one. Point two is we can't identify Canadian and American Jewry. Just to give a statistic, only 1/3 of American Jews have been to Israel. 2/3 of Canadian Jews have been to Israel. If you look at every indicator of giving per capita to Israel, the number of young people who go on Israel abroad programs, it's much higher in Canada than in the U.S. So the gap that Peter points out, which I agree does exist in the U.S., it's not quite as great, the gap between the Canadian Jewish establishment and the Canadian Jewish rank and file. But it does exist in the United States, and I think it is growing. And if I can just insert a personal comment, I teach Israeli history. I've taught it at Harvard and Columbia, as well as at the University of Toronto. And I've had students who approach me at Harvard, and they said, I'd like to take your course. These are Jewish students, but I'm not going to because I don't want to get into arguments with my friends about Israeli politics. The campus atmosphere is unpleasant, and I would just as soon not get involved.
David, I think you need to address that. That's clearly out there, where there's a discomfort among way too many young Jewish kids in North America today who have a lot of, maybe unlike our generation or previous generations, who have more Muslim friends, for whom this is a real point of departure. What do you say to that?
Well, what I would say to that is, look, it has never been an easy destiny to be a Jew. But for people who live in North America in this day and age, it is probably easier than it has ever been for any generation of Jews anywhere in history. So little is asked that to brave a little unpleasantness is nothing compared to the sacrifices that other people have made. And if Derek's students don't have that kind of fortitude, I would hope, I know he's a professor, but I would hope that as a counselor, he would urge them to stiffen their spines, to think about what it has been like for others, and to show a little more courage.
Derek, do you do that?
No, I don't talk down to my students. These are adults, and
that's not talking down to them. That's talking to man to man.
No,
woman
no,
to man to woman.
No, I don't think. I think it is talking down because they make decisions based on their own value system, based on what matters to them. And the fact is, they do have a very legitimate gripe that I also run into quite often. These are young people who do feel attachments to Israel. They care about Israel, and they often feel like they don't have a venue in which they can speak about Israel in a critical way without being accused of being spineless or much worse. And I've run into this on university campuses, both in the United States and in Canada. And this is also something that Peter referred to in his article.
Peter, tell me this. Why do you think, what would be the significance of this generation, young people in their high teens, early 20s, becoming disillusioned and or somewhat more disassociated with Israel?
Well, I have two fears. I mean, one of which David actually alluded to. It is, again, I am a liberal Zionist. But I want a Zionism that admires and loves Israel, not only because it's a state for Jews, but because it is a liberal democratic Jewish state. And my fear is that many of the evangelical Christians, for instance, who David is referring to, do not adhere to a liberal vision of Zionism. You know, Dick Armey said a few years ago that he would have no problem basically putting the Palestinians in Jordan onto buses and sending them out to the West Bank. That's not my Zionism. And my fear is that as younger liberal American Jews drift away, what you will see, at least in the U.S., maybe in Canada it's a little bit different, is essentially a kind of an alliance between conservative evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews who are growing in number in the U.S. and tend to, although I have great affection, personal affection and connection to the Orthodox Jewish community, tends to have a much less liberal vision of Zionism. And so that's, to me, a threat to liberal Zionism. I also think the other threat, if I could just mention, is that if liberal Zionism as a category declines in the United States, partly the result will be disaffection. Partly the result will be more and more people on the U.S. left turning to the idea of a binational state. I myself have been struck since my article by how much more mainstream that position is on the blogs than I had realized, to the degree to which it becomes harder and harder to articulate a liberal Zionism. I think we will have a liberal non-Zionism that I think as a Zionist is really disturbing to me.
That binational state, John Mearsheimer, that Peter just referred to, do you think that's where it's going eventually? Is that the solution?
Yes, I've recently written on this, and I'm a staunch advocate of a two-state solution. I think a two-state solution is the best alternative for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, and for the United States. But I do not believe that you're going to get a two-state solution. I believe you're going to get a greater Israel. And I think, as Ehud Olmert said, and as Ehud Barak has said now, if that were to happen, that state would be an apartheid state. They have both said that.
Just explain, when you say greater Israel, just to explain what you mean by that.
A greater Israel would be pre-1967 Israel plus the occupied territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It would include basically everything between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And I think within those confines now, you have about 5.6 million Israeli Jews and about 5.5 million Palestinians. And when you look at the birth rates, it won't be long before you have more Palestinians than Jews in that greater Israel. And that's why so many people believe that that greater Israel will be an apartheid state. And Olmert's point is that that will be the end of the Jewish state because it will be impossible to defend an Israel that is an apartheid state in the West. Because in the West, we simply could not tolerate supporting an apartheid state. It's much easier to support Israel if you're talking about Israel inside the pre-1967 borders, which of course is why people like Olmert want to go to a two-state solution.
Okay, let me get David Frum on this. If we are moving, I don't say we are, but if we are moving, as some would suggest, because of a lack of support in liberal Zionist headquarters here in North America, inexorably towards the vision that John just suggested, what's your view of how not to get there? Because I assume you don't want to go there.
I don't think I think actually it's a nightmare scenario that, like all nightmares, isn't very realistic. Look, the ideal hope.
But what's the alternative?
The ideal hope is that there is some kind of negotiated settlement. That, of course, would be a great thing. And back in the 1990s, I was one of those who hoped for it and would have welcomed it. I think that matching Peter's description of some Jews moving to the left, there are many of us who have been hardened by painful experience and have lost a lot of our hope and enthusiasm for the possibility. But if it happens, we'd be glad. But if it doesn't happen, or if it doesn't happen soon, I think it's perfectly feasible to imagine some kind of unresolved sovereignty in which the people on the West Bank and Gaza largely govern themselves but don't have all of the formalities of the state. This is a very common thing all over the planet. I mean, that flotilla, for example, departed from Turkish Cyprus, which is Turkish-occupied territory in the northern half of Cyprus. Nobody on the planet recognizes the legality of the Turkish occupation of the northern half of Cyprus, and yet the planet somehow manages to stumble along with the Turks running half of Cyprus and the legal government of Cyprus only running the other half of Cyprus.
Peter, let me get you to respond to something that Stephen Cohen wrote in Foreign Policy magazine a couple of weeks ago. I'll read a couple of paragraphs of his article, and then you come back with your response. Mainstream pro-Israel organizations are, in fact, booming, thank you. AIPAC's income from donations is now 5 times what it was in 2000, and 60 times what it was when I joined the organization in 1982. It is growing commensurately in membership, including young people, and influence too. The Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish community are also roaring tigers. My own impression is that the post-Iraq disaffection of some young Jews today is in fact less, rather than more pronounced, than the Vietnam distress that afflicted many when I first got involved. There's nothing new about a minority of Jews disliking Israel, except all the attention they are getting. Your take on that?
I think, first of all, that was Steve Rosen, I think, if I remember, not Stephen Cohen.
Oh, forgive me, okay.
But look, AIPAC is a very well-run and successful organization. But what I'm talking about are longer-term trends about whether you're going to find as many people in the younger generation as there are in their 50s and 60s and 70s. And I think if you look at the work of Stephen Cohen of Hebrew Union College, what you find really clearly is even discounting for life cycle effects in which people might become more committed as they have kids, you're seeing this secular decline amongst non-Orthodox young American Jews. I'm not saying that AIPAC doesn't have any group of younger people to draw from, or the Anti-Defamation League or the American Jewish Committee. My suggestion was their only ranks from which they can draw large numbers in the coming decades will be from within the Orthodox American Jewish community, which is, the American Jewish community asked, do you feel very close to Israel? Amongst American Jews, 18 to 40. Amongst non-Orthodox American Jews, it was 16%. Amongst Orthodox American Jews, it was 79%, to give you a sense of the gap. And I think those Orthodox Jews, perhaps in tandem with the evangelical Christians and maybe some Catholics that David was talking about, will move these organizations become more and more essentially like the Lieberman-Netanyahu Shas government. And I think that will mean that will further alienate younger Jews with liberal values. So yes, AIPAC can find younger Jews, but I think they're going to be younger Jews who are really out of step with where the large majority of American Jews are and who don't have the values that I would hope that Zionists would have.
Derek?
Yeah, I think these remarks by Steve Rosen were very misleading.
In what respect?
Well, first of all, financially. I mean, okay, so AIPAC is making a lot of money, which is very nice, but the fact is American Jewish donations to Israel are going down consistently year after year. I think the Jewish Agency got something like $120 million last year out of the annual Federation fundraising, maybe half what it had gotten previously. If you look at total American Jewish
last year, then it might have hit
no, but if you look over the long term, over the last like 15 years, there's been a steady decline, certainly in the amount of money that American Jewish federations give to Israel, because they're keeping more money for needs at home, which partly reflects economic needs and partly reflects changing attitudes towards Israel on the ground. So part of it is financial. The fact is American Jewish aid to Israel now, not American government aid, but private Jewish aid amounts to less than 1% of Israel's annual budget. The state of Israel doesn't really need it and doesn't notice it. So there is a growing gap between the two communities. And that's also a gap over time. If you look at these statistics that Peter's referring to, it's not just what's happening today. 20 years ago, the level of American Jewish support for Israel was much higher than it is today. The percentage of American Jews who felt the country was very important to them. And that goes beyond changes over age, it's also change over time.
David, let me ask you a question a bit out of left field here. What did you find the least surprising thing that took place this past week? Starting with the flotilla, perhaps the reaction to it, what was the least surprising thing to emerge this past week?
The least surprising thing was that the new UN Human Rights Council or Commission, I forget what title it gives itself these days, voted 32-3 to condemn Israel, with countries like Syria, Libya, which I think is now on the Commission, leading the way. I mean, just the hypocrisy so rank, it would be funny if it were not sad.
John, what did you find the least surprising development this week?
The fact that Israel's supporters backed Israel down the line and went to great lengths to tar and feather all of the critics. It was business as usual. Here's a case where Israel goes out and behaves in a boneheaded fashion, and its defenders in the United States are making arguments, many of which are ludicrous, and in my opinion, do damage to them and do damage to Israel.
Peter, the least surprising thing this week?
Well, gosh, I think David and John have pretty much covered both of what I think is least surprising. Maybe if I could just approach it a slightly different way. I think what has been most striking to me what we have this now enormous chasm in the United States between where intellectual and journalistic commentary is, in which, in fact, there was an enormous amount of criticism of Israel's actions, and where Congress is, where there is still an overwhelming silence about being willing to criticize Israeli policy in almost any circumstance. It's that chasm that I think has really opened up in the past few years in the United States. And I think for me, the big question is, can Congress continue in this way? Or are we going to see the defection of certain important Jewish members of Congress from the position of no public criticism?
Peter, may I jump in? That is a little bit like the old joke about storm over channel, continent cut off. It is probably right that Congress, reflecting the opinion of the overwhelming majority of the American public, is once again not in harmony with the opinion as expressed in the blogs and the intellectual journals. I think congressmen bent on re-election, however, will want to pay attention to the 70% of Americans who support Israel. We have not yet had the wave of polling after this from the United States after this incident. I expect that it will show enormous support in the United States for what Israel has done, and that's why Congress is not following the New York Review of Books and the blogs in what is, after all, an election year.
Quick comeback, Peter. Go ahead.
David is right that most Americans support Israel, but most Americans do not support a position of no public criticism of Israel in the way that Congress does. There is some element of public opinion here, but I'm sure David would agree. There's also a very large element here of political influence that comes from financial donations, in particular, which is not necessarily a reflection of public opinion.